Here we'll be looking at Microsoft Windows deployment. Here we'll be covering 6 main topics. The Microsoft Windows deployment type. This covers the different methods and use cases we'll be running through. Then we'll run through the Windows versions, what they are, and what the features are, and what use case you'd use them in certain scenarios. Then how you go about doing a migration, be it via wipe and load versus side-by-side migration. We'll then run through the Windows provisioning, how we move from provisioning online via the cloud. Then how we go about activating our licenses via a subscription, which is the way Microsoft are now moving. And then lastly, the difference between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. Here we'll be running through the Microsoft Windows deployment types. Here we'll do a high-level overview of the deployment types, and we have 5 different main types of deployment types. We have the fresh installation, the in-place upgrade, and a combination of the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, be it with the Windows Assessment and Deployment Toolkit, or alternatively the Endpoint Configuration Manager. And we'll finish it off with the Windows Auto Deployment. Fresh installation is essentially when you are installing Microsoft Windows on a single device, be it from a USB stick or a hard disk drive. Now, it's good if it's for one single device. However, when you are scaling up to, let's say, a couple of hundred or even 1,000, you may have difficulty taking that one single USB stick or several to a few thousand machines, so it doesn't really scale up well. In-place upgrade is traditionally used when you're upgrading the version of Microsoft Windows. Now, it is very quick and easy in that you have a wizard and a graphical user interface to follow the steps along. And the great thing is you get to also carry forward your applications. However, the con is that you carry forward all your files, including those that are corrupt, and may cause you issues post-upgrade in that you may have issues with your corrupt files. The Microsoft Deployment Toolkit is essentially a graphical user interface. Essentially, it's a workspace whereby you can manage your deployment and you have your main tools. It includes things such as your operating system, your applications, packages, task sequence, advanced configuration, monitoring, and more. Here we'll be covering ADK, which is the Windows Assessment Deployment Toolkit. It's a set of tools that will essentially help you image Microsoft Windows. There are a number of different tools and they each have their own acronym, but we'll be covering it from a high-level overview in the subsequent slides. So we have the Application Compatibility Toolkit, the User State Migration Toolkit, the Deployment Imaging and Service Management, Volume Activation and Management Tool, the Image and Configuration Designer Tool, the User Experience Virtualization, the Application Virtualization, the Performance and Assessment Tool, and Windows PE, which is your pre-installation environment. Here we're going to cover the Windows Assessment and Deployment Toolkit, otherwise known as ADK. Now this has a number of tools, namely the Application Compatibility Toolkit, otherwise known as ACT. This will essentially scan your hardware and identify any compatibility issues with your applications in the event it does move over to a new operating system. It tends to suggest some shims or alternatively patches so that the application experiences less outage once it does move over to a new operating system. That being said, certain applications may not be designed or prepped to go to a new operating system, so do check with the supplier of that application. We then have the User State Migration Toolkit, otherwise known as USMT. This will essentially carry out 2 main actions, the scan state and load state. Scan state will essentially carry out a backup of the image, whilst load state will restore the image. We then have the Deployment Imaging and Service Management, otherwise known as DISM. This will essentially carry out a capture of a snapshot of your image, whilst the deployment of that image will be pushed out to the intended device. We also have the Volume Activation and Management Tool, otherwise known as VAMT. This will essentially carry out inventory of all the hardware and ensure that anything that has not been activated by Microsoft Windows is identified and you're prompted to activate it where applicable. We also have the Imaging and Configuration Designer, otherwise known as ICD. This will essentially configure an image traditionally pushed out via a third-party vendor. They tend to introduce quite a lot of unwanted or unnecessary applications, so you can configure that. That being said, you need to operate on an on-premise environment for this. Continuing with the remaining tools, we also have the user experience virtualization. This will store the settings across all the devices so that there is a unified experience in that the settings and preferences are stored from one device to another, giving a unified experience. We also have the application virtualization known as AppV, and this is where the applications are packaged on a server on a file, and that's made available to all users via a shortcut so that the users don't necessarily need to use the resources locally on their device, but they're essentially using resources on the server. We also use the performance and assessment tools. This will scan your estate of hardware and make an assessment if there are going to be any up and coming issues in the event that that hardware is upgraded from one operating system to another. And also we have Windows PE, otherwise known as a pre-installation environment, and it's a command line that uses your DISM, your deployment imaging service management, and it will essentially capture and deploy your image. Endpoint Configuration Manager will essentially wipe and rebuild the entire machine. It is a zero-touch installation in that it does capture and deploy the image. Windows Autopilot can be found on the cloud. Essentially, you provision the image by pushing it out based upon the device ID of that device. That will need to be registered on the cloud, and provided it's connected to the internet, Microsoft Intune will push the image out along with the applications via the internet to that device. Here we'll be covering the different versions of Microsoft Windows, their respective features, as well as their use case. So we have Microsoft Windows Home, Microsoft Windows Pro, the Microsoft Windows Pro for workstations, the Microsoft Windows Enterprise, the Windows Enterprise LTSC, the Windows Pro Education, and lastly, Microsoft Windows Education. Windows Home will cover a number of different features. They include the updates that will essentially ensure that your machine is secure and stable. We have always on VPN, which is what enables your machine to be able to connect to the corporate network even though you may not be on site. You have firewall and virus protection. This will control the traffic in and out your device, as well as ensuring that there's no malicious activity going on your device. Device encryption is in the event that your device is compromised. The files and hard disk are essentially not going to be readable. The media tools will include things such as your photos, videos, emails, essentially anything that will assist you in getting out on the media. Virtual Desktop will essentially provide you features so that you can essentially have additional desktops on one single desktop. Windows Hello is essentially an authentication method, be it biometric, be it through face, fingerprint recognition, and then Edge is essentially the browser, which is one of the most stable and secure browsers. Windows Pro has its own set of features. The Enterprise State Roaming. This essentially would mean that the user settings are stored and will replicate as a user moves from one device to another device, providing a unified experience. You have the user interface control, and this is where the start menu can be personalized. The updates essentially will ensure that your Windows operating system remains stable with the latest patches and updates. Hyper-V, otherwise known as Hypervisor, proprietary to Microsoft Windows, will essentially allow you to emulate virtual machines. Remote Desktop will allow you to be able to remote into another device. Microsoft Purview will allow the compliance through the cloud. BitLocker will provide encryption on your hard disk drive in the event that you have unauthorized access and will make sure that the files are not readable. Group policies are central policies that are applied by your organization traditionally to ensure that an IT policy is standardized across the whole company. Azure Active Directory is essentially on a server where it will control your computer users and groups, but on the cloud. Domain join will essentially allow your device to join a customized domain for that specific company. Mobile device management support will provide support for mobile devices. As the name suggests, it could be things such as the Android, iOS, as well as laptops and devices that are on the move. dynamic provisioning or applications that need to be provisioned. And lastly, Windows Autopilot is essentially devices that images can push out to device IDs that are on the internet. Windows Pro for Workstation also has a set of features. We have the expanded hardware support. This is tailored support for high-end workstations. The server messenger block is to access high intensive files across the network more rapidly. That's known as SMB. You have persistent memory, which is data that's stored across a temporary memory in the event of an unattended shutdown. And lastly, the resilient file system RFS is where you have redundancy in the event of a hardware disk failure. Windows Enterprise also has its features. We have desktop analytics, which will send the data about your desktop and analytics to a portal so it can be reviewed by the company. You have the Microsoft User Experience Virtualization, which is essentially UEV. This is where the settings of a user are stored so that it can be standardized as they move from one device to another, thereby creating a unified experience. You have the Microsoft Application Virtualization. This is where your applications are not stored locally, but essentially in a virtualized environment. You have the Microsoft Defender Application Guard. This is where your applications are essentially going to be encrypted. The Microsoft Defender Application Control controls your applications that can be used within your environment. The Start Menu Layout Control will personalize and customize the start menu for your organization. Universal Print will give end users access to printers without the printers having to be installed, essentially a plug and play experience. App Locker will control the apps that are within your device. We do have the Windows Enterprise LTSC. This is a long-term servicing channel, and essentially it will delay the features for updates that will normally be pushed out to your device. You have up to 2 to 3 years as a standard, and you can select which updates to select via the Windows apps as well. Windows S Mode is a stripped down version of Microsoft Windows operating system. It only allows you to use the apps within the Microsoft App Store. That being said, if there are any legacy applications that are outside of it, you may have difficulty in accessing that. That being said, there is a workaround to actually access them. But once you've switched off Windows S Mode, you won't be able to switch it back on, and you can only use the Microsoft Edge browser. Here we'll be looking at the two main methods for migration. We have the wipe and load migration, and we have the side-by-side migration. Now, with the wipe and load migration, it's primarily used on one device. It's where you will use scan state to carry out a backup of the image on the device. You will then wipe it and then use load state to then essentially deploy the new image. That being said, the applications may not necessarily pull over, so you may need to manually install them going forward. It does carry over all files, including your corrupt files, so that may unintentionally affect the installation or migration when you are loading up your new operating system. On the other hand, side-by-side migration, as you mentioned, is on two devices. You would use scan state on the original device. This is to carry out a backup of the image. And then on the new device, you would use load state to deploy or restore that image. That being said, it does have the benefit of you having access to your original device, so you can make reference to it. And when that user is fully happy, they can decommission the original device. We'll be looking at Microsoft Windows provisioning via Autopilot. Microsoft is now moving over to the provisioning model. This is essentially using Autopilot. Essentially, what it involves is obtaining the device ID of your device. You can obtain this from the manufacturer. Upon doing so, you can upload this onto the portal, and provided you've configured a profile, an out-of-box experience will initiate on that device. This also includes all the relevant applications, and it doesn't necessarily need to be on a domain. Ideally, it will be good though. However, you do require the Autopilot license. And by doing so, the out-of-box experience will start in terms of loading Microsoft Windows operating system using the zero-touch installation method. That being said, You don't necessarily need to use the Autopilot or Intune method. You can go via the Windows ADK, the Assessment and Deployment Toolkit, and it is free. However, it does require you to install this on the Windows server that will need to be on-premise, and all devices will need to be on-premise as well, or connected to the corporate network, ideally, in the event you don't want to use the licensing version for Autopilot via Intune. Here we'll look at subscription-based activation. In this demonstration, we're going to run through the subscription-based activation. So in here, you need to navigate to office.com and sign in with your administrator credentials, which you should have set up in the previous session. You now need to go to the admin portal, which is admin.microsoft.com. Before we continue, one of the things that you need to do is if you go to the billing and check the licenses, you can see that we currently have E5 licenses, namely Office 365 for E5 and Microsoft 365 for E5. This will provide us more comprehensive applications within the Office 365 portal. This will cover primary security. However, the main thing that we are missing for our subscription-based activation for Windows is the Windows 10/11 for E3 as a minimum. And neither of them will have that. So in light of it, what we need to do is navigate over to our purchase services. This will now in turn launch all the recommended products. What we can do is go to all products. And then what we can do is navigate over to the search pane and search for E3. And this will provide a list of E3. Now, if we scroll down, we'll notice that there's one for Windows 10/11 Enterprise E3. And this will provide the Windows operating system that we'll need for our virtual machine. Now what we do is if we can go over to here, go to details, you can then in turn pick a relevant subscription length. I'm just doing this purely for the purpose of this demonstration. Now what we'll need to do is go over to subscription length. I'm just doing it for this demonstration, so I'm going to keep it for 1 month and pay monthly. I will cancel it after within the 1 month period, so I'm not getting any further charges. And once I'm ready to proceed, I'll click on buy. As you can see, it will take some time. And I'm going to place the order. As you can see, I now get a confirmation, thank you for your order, and I can manage my subscription. Now that I navigate to billing licenses, you can now see that I have a Windows 10/11 Enterprise E3 license. I have also created an email account as a brand new domain, pm@veryit365.co.uk. What I now need to do is create that user within my portal. So if I now add a user, I can call it pm at veryit.co.uk. Create a password. Create next. Allocate that license. Allocate the other two, given that I have the licenses available. As you can now see, I have now created the user and I've allocated the license as well as the Windows 10, 11 Enterprise E3. That being said, if the user already existed, I could always have gone through the the licenses, go into the license here, and assign the license to the individual. But given this is a brand new user, I've just done it this way for now. Here, we'll be looking at the difference between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop, otherwise known as AVD. Here we have a high-level overview of the difference between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop. With Windows 365, it's primarily used for a small set of users, whilst with Azure Virtual Desktop, it's used for a high number of users. Now, with both of them, they are both hosted on the cloud, but the difference is with the Windows 365, you are paying a subscription base for the hardware. That includes things such as your GPU, the CPU, the storage space, the power, the processor, etc. However, with the Azure Virtual Desktop, you're essentially getting access to a host pool, and this is where a set of virtual machine profiles are stored centrally. That way you can access any of those virtual machines at any given time, but it will store your profile on the cloud. Now, with the Azure Virtual Desktop, it's on a pay-as-you-go basis. In relation to Azure Virtual Desktop, you don't necessarily need the necessary hardware. You can use something called a dummy terminal, otherwise known as the Thin Client. It's a low specification machine, but provided you've got access to the internet and can access the Windows 365, you should be able to interface with the higher spec that you require.